In the late 1800s, two paleontologists shook the modern world in a competitive war that disregarded collaboration and teamwork. Inadvertently, they modeled the importance of diplomacy and cooperation. The story of Edward Drinker Cope and Nathaniel Charles Marsh tells of one of the greatest scientific feuds in history. Through the process of their battle, they discovered hundreds of dinosaur species and redefined American science, in the process destroying each other.
The story begins with the birth of Othniel Charles Marsh in a poor farmhouse in New Hampshire. He was expected to have little future, but his rich uncle George Peabody funded his education at Yale, where he later went on to teach in the science department. Marsh then left the university so he could spend more time in the field researching his beloved dinosaurs. That is where he met his lifelong enemy, Edward Drinker Cope.
Cope, on the other hand, had a very bright future. He had the support of a rich Quaker family, and by a young age was already creating detailed drawings of lizards and other vertebrate animals. At a young age, Cope attended the University of Pennsylvania and assisted in the excavation of the second full dinosaur under the acclaimed Joseph Leidy. As both scientists progressed in the field of paleontology, they became aware of each other. They started off as acquaintances, but they soon began to dislike each other.
Cope invited Marsh to visit his hadrosaur pits. Marsh came without hesitation. After looking around for some days, Marsh bribed all of Cope's workers to send all future finds to him instead of Cope. Weeks later, when the pits started to dry up, Cope finally realized what Marsh had done, and from then on marked Marsh as his enemy.
In another incident, Cope had worked for several months and finally reconstructed the Elasmosaurus, a monster of the sea. He believed this to be a short-necked and extremely long-tailed beast, but when inspected by Marsh and Joseph Leidy, it was determined that, in fact, the neck was long and the tail was short. Cope had placed the head of the beast on the wrong end. Cope took this as a personal insult, and from then on, despised Marsh.
By this time, Marsh was jealous of Cope, and therefore dedicated himself to finding every mistake in Cope's work, instead of paying attention to his own. In 1873, Marsh was appointed the first professor of paleontology at Yale College. This opened up many opportunities for Marsh, and he led one of the first paleontologist expeditions out west. Marsh and his crew went through many heroic adventures, including violent Indians and poisonous snakes. Marsh, being the opportunist that he was, made sure that all of these discoveries made headlines back east. With this first expedition, Marsh had not only advanced paleontology, but also staked out his claims in the bone fields of the West. He would not be willing to share with anyone, especially Cope.
That has always been the way with paleontologists. Many of them want to claim a huge tract of land or a particular geological formation. Say, well, you can't do anything there. Don't write about it. We have that instance with a scientist in Yellowstone Park who has for 50 years not let anybody in Yellowstone Park to study the geology of it. And consequently, nobody knows whether he's right or wrong.
Back east, Marsh received a visit from one of Europe's top paleontologists, Thomas Henry Huxley. Both scientists were devout supporters of Darwinism, and Marsh presented Huxley with numerous amazing finds that proved Darwin's theory of evolution. He had pieced together the world's first birds and had fossil evidence of every link in the evolution of horses, from the tiny ancient ancestor, the three-toed horse, to the modern-day species. Darwin himself thanked Marsh profusely for his revolutionary work.
Because Cope was not supported by a wealthy institute, he needed to find an alternate way out west in order to keep up with Marsh. He joined the Hayden Geological Survey and took many trips out west with them. Eventually, however, Cope needed to find his own way around.
In 1878, all the branches of the survey joined into one, and Marsh was elected head paleontologist, leaving Cope in the cold.
Cope had to rely on his inheritance for funding, selling his house and his bone collection.
Both Cope and Marsh were working at a dig site in Colorado when a railroad worker by the name of William Harlow Reed contacted Marsh claiming that they had unearthed a massive dig site at Como Bluff, Wyoming. When Marsh arrived at Como Bluff, it was instantly evident that he had come upon a massive cache of dinosaur bones. The hillside was covered in the remains of ancient life.
The whole world is littered with wonderful stone books of periods that have long since passed, where dinosaurs are and other forms of life for millions and millions of years. Wyoming, because we don't have a lot of timber and lots of mountains, that's exposed all of these wonderful rock formations. And we look at the composition of them and what age they are, and some of them, like the Morrison Formation, are chock full of big fossils, dinosaurs.
When Cope heard of the success Marsh was having at Como Bluff, he came to look for himself. When he got there, Marsh had already unearthed the majority of the bones near the railroad station. But with the help of some workers, Cope traveled a short distance and wasn't let down, for there were as many bones here as there were at the station. The tension was very high with Cope and Marsh working so close together. They had their workers spy on and steal bones from the other quarries. They were so reluctant to let unwanted bones fall into the other's possession that they would rather destroy them than leave them in the pits. Even today, no one knows what was lost through this carelessness. As the situation grew more charged, the competition overtook each man. Marsh stole credit from Cope and Associates and neglected to pay his workers, while Cope rushed to discredit Marsh. As both sought to expose the other's growing list of misdemeanors, they brought their feud to the public through a series of shocking articles published in the New York Herald. In the end, Marsh was fired from his position in the National Geological Survey, and Cope went completely broke due to a desperate investment in a silver mine that he hoped would fund his research. Both lost the majority of their dinosaur collection and their credibility as paleontologists. And shortly after, tragedy struck. Cope died in 1897 at the age of 56. In 1899, Marsh too passed away, putting to rest one of the greatest scientific feuds of all time.
The two paleontologists literally fought to the death, leaving behind a legacy that put American science on the map for the first time. Marsh discovered countless species and played a huge role in supporting Darwinism.
Near the end of his life, Cope kept many of his finds to himself for fear of theft. But a few months before Cope's death, he was contacted by Charles R. Knight, a young artist who carried on Cope's life work by depicting many fantastic beasts he discovered and sparking the public's fascination. This story shows that although competition can be productive and helpful, too much of it turns out to be very destructive. No one knows today what was lost due to their competitive personalities, or what could have been achieved if they had worked together. As said by John Dingell, war is the failure of diplomacy.